interesting shape. Yeah, we'll have to figure it out together.
Cool.
So I imagine this is a variation on G. Yeah. It's like a
Right. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you're in drop D.
mhm,
And
D.
so this is if we just go note by note.
It'd be F because that's E.
Okay, O F and then C and then G and then C D G. That's a crazy chord. It's cool that drop D lets you do that. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so these chords are kind of funny because there isn't a third. And so if we're looking at chords where there isn't like a third, so there isn't like a clear triad that we can break it down to, its personality is like a little bit not quite amorphous, maybe a little bit amorphous, but it's like it can be a bunch of different things. And so it kind of just boils down to like what note is in the bass. And from there, I guess there could be an argument to like how you hear it. But if F is in the bass, then I'm going to hear these notes as basically being like the five and the nine. And then this is the five again. And then that's like a 13. And then that's that's the nine again. So,
And if I'm using a capo so that I can have open C and F strings, right? Because
mhm,
that's what those notes would be
right.
throughout. I still don't have a fifth or a third, right? I
Yeah,
just
okay. And so actually could I hear what you're doing with that chord with the
sure.
capo?
Yeah, let me just live perform my way through it. And then it starts over again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So
first off,
first
that
off, that
sounds really
sounds really
cool. Um okay, yeah. So that first chord it is this guy, right? For some reason there was something that sounded like it was down a whole step. Are you drop tuned a whole step plus drop D or are you just kind of in standard with drop D?
Just drop the E string down to D. So
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay. So to me, I basically am hearing this as like a very, very rich F chord with all of the things that make it sound like kind of a more familiar or maybe more like cliched F chord, like stripped out. Um, yeah, and so basically, I think of this would be like a replacement for an F chord. There are other things that it could be, like if we have a D and an F in this chord, and then we also have like a C. There's an argument to be made that this could be like an inversion of a D minor chord. This could be like a D minor 11 over F or something. The 11 would be the G. So you could say that, but in this case, it really just sounds like an F chord to me. It sounds like an F chord with a really kind of like sophisticated sound floating above the root. Um, a way that I've started to think about harmony that's pretty non-standard, um, but I think might actually be related to this way of thinking about harmony in kind of like an intuitive way, comes from spending a lot of time thinking about like harmonics and thinking about basically like alternative tuning systems. So like this thing called like just intonation, and this other thing in music, in kind of classical music called spectralism, which are basically just like different people doing more or less the same thing, which is like using things from the harmonic series to write chords. And I think just with guitars, because we have feedback and we have distortion, and what distortion kind of does is like amplifies harmonics, we're already pretty close to that sound world just by using distortion. Not exactly the same thing, but there are a lot of similarities. Um, and so the way that I've started to think about a lot of harmony has like identifying the roles of the intervals relative to the root is useful, but it's also interesting to think about it like if it's like thinking about it as basically like a sound that's kind of this like stack of frequencies. And in this case, I basically hear it as like our bass note is F, and so that tells us what's going on with like the root or like with the bass line. And then everything above that is kind of just like a set of things that give us a feeling. And I think I've been able to get to this just kind of like fundamental like level where like this sounds super like non-technical to be like just a bunch of things that give us a feeling that like float above this bass note. But I think once I moved away from working in equal temperament, that's really what I'm going off of, is just like, oh well, I can do this. And so this kind of brought me back to like shoegaze stuff and a lot of like 90s stuff, because basically like the root is telling us pretty much like what's going on, you know, with the chord progression, and then everything above that are just kind of these like sets of feelings that are moving around, you know. And so in this case, it just sounds like an F with an emphasis on all these notes that are not, with an emphasis on the C and on D and on G, basically on all these intervals that are not the third, but they all resonate in really interesting ways. Like the C, the C is a perfect fifth, the D is a ninth, and then D is like a 13, and there's only one 13 in there. So it's mostly, I believe, so it's mostly fifths and ninths, with that one D as like a note that provides like a little bit more kind of like flavor, but it's like non-standard flavor. And you could say that there's a third between D and F, in that you could play an F here, so it's like a third down or a sixth up, and that kind of has to do with the like, is it an F chord? Is it like an F6? Is it a D chord? And the answer is like, because there isn't like a clear triad thing, it's open like this. But this is how I would think about it. There's one other thing that I want to point out in relation to like resonance and like the harmonic series, which is that in the harmonic series, the first interval that we get that's not an octave is a perfect fifth. So if we were to move up the harmonic column on an E chord or on an E string, our first harmonic is an octave, and then the next harmonic, or rather the first harmonic that is not the open string, so harmonic 2 is the octave. The fundamental or the open string is like the first harmonic, and then the next one is the perfect fifth. So when we work with perfect fifths, we're really kind of like aligning ourselves with the harmonic series. And this is why power chords only have fifths and octaves, and it's why they work so well with distortion. Because if we get this, and then we distort it, it's gonna like give us tons of harmonics that are all kind of really related to each other. For reasons that I'll figure out how much detail I should get into. Okay, really quick, there's this idea that I'll just briefly mention, which is like a harmonic column, meaning like this, like when you listen to a sound, you can listen to the open string, and if you listen to it for long enough, you'll also start to have time to listen to the harmonics and all the frequencies that are above the fundamental. And so when you have two notes that are very closely related in a harmonic series, they resonate together in a way that sounds really nice. And the reason that they resonate together is that they share a lot of the same harmonics. So if we look at all the notes that are harmonics of E, or whatever, and then we look at the notes that are like harmonics of, just to give the example of like an E power chord, and then if we look at all the notes that are harmonics of B, we have B, which is a harmonic of E. It's the third harmonic of E. We have another B, which is another harmonic of E. And then we have F sharp, which is also a harmonic of E. It's like the ninth harmonic. And then we have, what is that? Another octave. That's another B. So that's also in the harmonic series on E. And then things start to get a little funny We have like a D sharp, which is like the 15th harmonic of E. So that the numbers get higher. But like that's a lot of agreement right off the bat. So those two harmonic series or harmonic columns that are kind of emanating from each note really like align, and that's why like when those notes come in tune, it's like whoa, like it really clicks. Like there's more going on than just those two notes because they each note contains tons of like harmonics and higher frequencies that like come into alignment. And so when we're working in something like this with fifths and ninths, let's see if I can play this. You know, like this note has a lot of the same harmonics as this note, which has a lot of the same harmonics as this note, which has a lot of the same harmonics as this note, and then a lot of the same as this one. And so the only note that's really like poking out harmonically, in terms of like harmonic series content, not in terms of like fundamental content, fundamentals just meaning like the actual notes that we're playing, is the D. And so that's the one that kind of gives it like a little bit of extra like something. And so basically that's the way that I would understand that chord. Because like if we were to look at it from the like through the frameworks that we've been using, which are much more like how do the fundamentals, or in other words like the notes, the pitches relate to each other, it's almost like redundant to have that many octaves and stuff. But when we look at it from the perspective of resonance, all this stuff opens up. And so I think that's really what's going on with that chord. To me, it's like an F chord where kind of the harmonic space above the note F is like very, very rich, and it's oriented towards things that are not thirds. And so that's like that's a long form explanation of how I make sense of that chord when I see it.
Nice. So you think it omitting thirds creates this like moodless color, or like more abstract? Like thirds are like very like, you know, storybook.
Yeah, that's a cool question. I don't know if I used the words moodless or abstract. If I did, that's good to know. But like, yeah, well, what do you get from playing that chord? Like, what types of moods does that chord give you?
It reminds me of like a friend that grew up playing like a lot of new metal. Um, I hear that sound when I am like jamming with them. So it's got like a lot of torque, you know? It's kind of just like a big truck. It's got this weird masculine sound. But I liked
Okay,
the
wait, I've got a really quick point there.
yeah.
So basically, what we're talking about at this point is like, how do we make sense of a sound? Like, how do we make sense of what a sound is making us feel? And the explanation that I gave has a lot to do with my own. I mean, there's a lot of my own relationship to music in there, where like there are things that I've thought about and listened to and studied that really had this like, you know, like kind of post just intonation thing, like this post just intonation framework, which is kind of like analysis of sound as frequencies. But then there's also the fact that this is a guitar. This is a clean guitar that's kind of bright. Like this isn't like the sound of like a muted, you know, like jazz box guitar being strummed in a certain way with a certain voicing that like triggers like a memory. And the memory that you have is associated with like nu metal. And so there's a question of association versus like the feeling of the sound. I'm going to put in itself in quotes because there's a question of how much we can remove sound from association. But it's kind of like also like if this was just sine waves playing the chord, it might be more intuitive to relate to it in the way that I was just explaining it. Sine waves or like sawtooth waves or something, because like sine waves don't have harmonics. That's like by definition, they're like just the frequency. But something with harmonics that is not a clean guitar. And then as soon as you strum those notes, we really get that like index of nu metal. And so it's like, I think timbre plays a role there. But it's really interesting. It's like when we're working with these sounds, we're working with pitch and harmony on their own. Oh yeah, yeah. Saw waves have harmonics and sine waves don't. That's a good yeah thing. But yeah, so basically it's like when we're working with guitars, when we're working with any instrument, there's this kind of like
Uh,
balancing of oh,
why
what's
is
up?
that saw waves have harmonics but sine waves don't?
Oh yeah. Um
Maybe
okay.
it's
I'll
more
just like
complicated.
yeah, yeah, I'll
Maybe.
just okay, wait. I'll finish this train of thought just while it's in my head, and then I'll talk about that. Okay. So also this is fun. Thanks for asking cool questions. Yeah. So basically, it's just like when we're writing on instruments, there's like all of the associations that a sound might bring up because of the history of that instrument, and then there's just like what that sound allows us to do when we just kind of look at it as like raw material. And then it can be said there is no raw material and everything is like loaded with like signification and meaning and stuff like that, which can be an interesting creative challenge. Um, I think that as artists we can like repurpose things and use like we could probably use that chord in a way that doesn't index like new metal, but we might need to like find a way around that or push back against it, you know, stuff like that. And even if it's like finger picked or if it's on an acoustic guitar, then we might just have like Corn unplugged, you know, like so. That's just yeah, okay. So that's the end of that spiel for now. As far as sine waves having harmonics and sine waves don't, so this is like the definition of these things. So like a sine wave is just a frequency with no harmonics, by definition, and then it sounds the way that it does because it sounds the way that it does. But I think, I mean, I could be slightly off in my history here, but I think that when people were first starting to make electronic music, there was like, oh, what if we just worked with one frequency? And so when you just have the one frequency, you have a sine wave. And then sometimes, like, if I open up like a sine wave, oh, sorry, Barad, I think you're muted right now.
Okay, and so to create a saw wave, you need to combine many sine waves, in fact, and so that's why it has harmonics. But the
Yeah.
sine wave itself has only one frequency because I got you. Okay, that makes sense. So it's clearly mathematical. It's just a mathematical reality of that's why I did. Okay.
Yeah. And then sometimes if you like try to use like when I try to like create sine waves using like a built-in like Ableton instrument or something like that, sometimes there will be other sounds, and that's not because of what sine waves are. It's because that like instrument wants to give you something that sounds like a sine wave, but it might have a little bit of like dirt on it or something. And as soon as you start adding dirt to it, it's no longer technically a sine wave. It's like something that sounds like a sine wave but has some distortion on it or something, which means that there are going to be harmonics. And so it's just like how much is a sine wave like the dictionary definition and how much is it like just a general sound, you know? Um, and so in my case, I'd say, oh, that's not a sine wave in this scientific definition, acoustic definition. This is like a sine wave that has effects on it, which makes it something else. Yeah, and then saw waves just similarly, they're just created like there's something specific. It's been like more than 10 years since I read about this, and I didn't totally understand it when I was like 19. But there's also just like the shape of the waveform, and so sine waves just are equally doing this, and for some reason that gives us a sound that doesn't have harmonics. And then like sawtooth waves, I think, kind of do this. They're like spiky. And I don't know exactly how the waveform relates to the harmonics, but I do know that basically the idea is that it has a ton of harmonics. And so actually, a lot of people who work with sawtooth waves will use like a low pass filter um, to kind of like soften it because saw waves on their own they're kind of like piercing. They're a little bit painful. But if you just like kind of round off the super high frequencies, they become a lot easier to listen to. And so yeah, that can just be an interesting thing to explore if you want to still keep the fact that it has harmonics, but not have it just be so many harmonics that go so high that it's kind of piercing and painful. Um, so it's kind of a note on saw waves. So this all branched off from talking about this F chord that's almost a G chord, but with an F in the bass. How is this feeling? Are there other questions or?
Yeah. I'll cut it off with this last question. So, Barat, for context, a lot of what I'm trying to work with is based off of like shoegaze music, which usually has like open strings and similar register, usually like played on. So, like
Mhm.
I'm not gonna like jump around too much. Like the bass is usually, or like the low end of whatever I'm playing is usually like the bottom two strings of the guitar. And there's like funny relationships between the chords that you play. So the next thing I was gonna show is like I do like this is the first chord I'm playing, right? And I can turn this on if you want to hear. So like there's this first chord, and then I open up the bottom two, but go uh, a full step up, right? And then that repeats, and then I just bring the low end of the strings back. So that creates like a subtle shift. There's all these subtleties that you want to achieve, like, or that I enjoy with shoegaze. And then I do the same relationship. So from here back to open, but even higher up, and then bring bring that down. And that's like the one what feels tense to me compared to everything else. And then just crawl my way back down to the first one. I think the only other options I have other than like an octave would be this one, which I imagine is a play on E. If this is supposed to be, sorry, you probably can't even see what I'm doing. And then that would be like an octave, and I'd be pretty close back to where I was. So yeah, I think the point or question I was trying to get into is like, okay, I've found this cool relationship, and I've made this like pretty fun mental game. Like the one thing that feels close to cathartic is just like that little shift in intention, and then the release, and like coming back to home, which is like, oh, we're starting over again. But I do want to break away from endless repetition, which was like the pain point we were talking about with all the stuff I was making before I turn off live performance. So now I'm in the same boat where I'm like, all right, how do I break this up, or what do I want to do? And some of the weird stuff I was thinking of, like when I was thinking about like Tim Hecker and stuff, was like, oh, what if I just track this and then like slow it down like 200% and see what it sounds like stretched out super far, and just like I'm sitting with that drone for longer, and maybe that'll give me some direction. Or yeah, I was like coming up with like accompaniment and just seeing if like there's a consistent harmonic that I can like play with as the bottom moves around. Uh, but I'm always like fishing for ideas if either of you have any.
Yeah, I have a bunch of thoughts. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. This is really cool. Um, yeah, okay. So I guess just first off, as far as like pacing for today and stuff goes, Barat, if we want to do some more like focused and applied stuff with you, we can totally make room to do that. And also, yeah, like I appreciate you being here, and yeah, like being, being present for the conversation, even when you're kind of not like, like the,
Sure.
yeah. So if you yeah, I mean,
It's cool stuff. So,
okay, cool. Awesome.
If you
Okay, yeah. So just kind of, I'm just checking in here, but then, yeah. Also, Brad, if you have any questions, or if there's anything that you want to cover, you can also just like drop it in the chat, and we'll make room for that. And so I'm just thinking about how to space this all out. But this isn't to like to dissuade Pat like from asking these questions. This is awesome, and I think this is going to be really cool to talk about. So, yeah.
I usually find stuff in between. So like just now that I've even said this stuff out loud, if you want to go Barat and I just kind of like mess with this, then we can switch back. That's cool with me too.
Yeah. I do want to say a bunch of stuff here though.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go
Yeah,
for it.
yeah. Okay. So, okay. So different things that are coming to mind are like, Pat example. Um, the first thing is just like harmony within what we've already got. Not sure if there's a desire to use time to unpack that. But this is just the first thing, is that there is some cool stuff going on. with these chords, but it sounds like the bigger thing is like getting out of this now that you've got this thing that you like. Um, just the one really quick harmonic tip that I'll give is that like if this first chord, right, is basically an F chord with a bunch of cool stuff floating above it, and then you move that shape around, then like when you're doing that starting on it's like over here, but you're in drop D, then this is going to be the same type of chord but with C in the bass, right? So it's basically like a C chord with a very specific sort of like resonance. Does that kind of make sense?
Uh,
I'll go over to drop D so that I can.
yeah. I mean, I still have the capo too, so it's like, but as long as you don't play the top two strings, you should be fine.
Cool. With this chord, were you using open strings?
I don't know if I go that high. I was playing with that while we were talking. Like,
Okay.
yeah, it's down here on
Yeah.
the third and fifth fret, and then up to the seventh, and then just put it down. So 5 and 7,
Yeah.
and then up to 10, and then I can go down here. And then what I was just thinking was where you were, but with the open
Oh, okay.
bottom.
Yeah.
Kind of cool.
Cool. Okay, yeah, so just whenever we move that shape around, like when you move up a whole step, from here, eventually over to here, this is basically a G chord with really cool resonance. Yeah, so that's just a thing that I was thinking about. And obviously the ones with the open strings are a little bit different, but that is just kind of that's just a framework that will apply. Okay, and so then the other thing that we're talking about, thing two, is transitions. Um, yeah, okay, because you don't want this to just be a song where it just these chords repeat indefinitely. Um, yeah, and so this brings me back to a question that we've been thinking about, I think, from a few different perspectives and with different types of sometimes different types of music. Um, so basically, okay, I'm just gonna ask like an intentionally very simple question, which is like for this specific chord progression, after you've played it a few times, what is it about this chord progression that makes you want to change something?
So I was just gonna post in the chat. I need a cliff. Like, it's a really good sounding set of chords,
Mhm.
and I like the relationships, putting them next to each other. Like, I think that that sequence sounds really nice to me. But I just need that one thing that sticks around too long, or like gets burned into your eyes, and then when you look away, you're like, oh wow, there's like this, you know, dramatic shift that's happened or whatever.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. It's like I don't really want to change radically. I'm just trying to insert this psychological tool that's like, oh, this sounds great. And then here's this like shift. And then that helps with like a release, of even if it's the repetition of what I was doing before with like a prime or something.
Hmm. And so just to be clear, is the thing that is the new section the cliff, or do you want kind of to have a cliff and then introduce a new section?
I'd say the new section, which what we were discussing before was like a lot of the things that I've brought to you,
Mhm.
tried to study them. There aren't really new chords being introduced to create the cliff. It's just a different arrangement for a moment, and then that has
Yeah,
a different, feeling to it. Um,
totally.
so yeah, it's like I kind of just need to find a new arrangement within the like chord.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Um, okay. There's something that I want to say about this that I think will be really helpful. But just to kind of to recap, making sure that I'm on the same page as you. Um, Creating a cliff means like you're repeating this and you want to go to another section that has the feeling. And by cliff, you mean it's kind of builds up and then there's sort of like a drop where there's this open space and we're just kind of a little bit like, whoa, from what we just heard. And does that sound accurate? Or because to me, what I'm my the first thought here was like a dynamic thing where something gets loud and then it gets quiet, and like the quietness of the following section gives us a chance to breathe after this loud point. So this might just be me bringing a bunch of baggage to this term cliff. Does this sound like what you were thinking about, or like am I kind of off here?
I wouldn't put it in terms of like velocity or like volume or anything like that. I would say like I've heard plenty of things that I'm referencing when I use that word that don't have that big shift. But I
Hmm.
think I think the thing that I used to say that I got corrected on is like tension, right? It's like I'm not creating tension, but maybe like the one is so like consonant and like just like home like,
Hmm.
like I'm trying to get as far away from home as possible, or like give you the sense that you're forgot where home is,
Hmm.
and when you get back you're like, oh nice, like this is that bedrock again. So
Yeah.
maybe think of it as like groundlessness, or like a an ultimatum point or something like that.
Okay. And so to kind of carry the cliff metaphor forward, like what is the relationship to the cliff? As in, like, are we going off the cliff? Are we like staring down the cliff? Are we like coming across a cliff, but we're at the base of it and we're looking up and we're like, oh, that's a really high rock face, you know? Like,
I'd say going off, so it's like
okay,
I'd like to create a thing that has like a either a hangnail type of feeling, or just like the need for catharsis, and then you bring that like cathartic moment in,
okay,
and it probably will be like the one, or back on that like uncomplicated simple sound that I had before.
okay. I think I'm following what you're saying now. It's cool to be able to work at this level of like abstraction. And I feel like sometimes people who intuit this level of abstraction when thinking about music get kind of like feel limited or boxed in by the kind of more like I don't know, maybe low level ideas about harmony. Like this is the one chord, this is the four chord. So what we're really talking about right now is like an experience that can be communicated through harmony or through register or through timbre or through a ton of different things. And so yeah, it's cool to be able to kind of talk about things on this like level of abstraction. I think one, just to make sure I'm following this metaphor correctly, and I think the reason I'm trying to be so specific about this, and make sure that I'm understanding it, is that it feels like this is kind of this is a maybe the crux of like what you're trying to figure out with writing B sections and stuff. Um, which is that it sounds like there's a feeling that you're after that you haven't quite like gotten yet. And so just because you mentioned that movement, I think from this chord to this one. Oh, not that. This one. This guy over here. It's something like that, where you pointed out that was kind of the point that felt like most tense to you. And so one of the things that's interesting that's going on in that moment, um, is basically that this chord, which I guess is kind of this like A sus kind of thing. Um, I'd have to think about it for a second and go note by note to tell whether it's like totally in the key, because this isn't like a chord voicing that I spent a lot of time thinking about. But it sounds like there might be like a note in there that's like slightly out of the key, but not in a way that sounds dissonant. It's just like a step into some kind of new space. It's kind of this like ambiguous harmonic space where you don't totally know what's happening, but there's a feeling, and the feeling, I think maybe because of the rhythm and because of the strumming and stuff, feels confident enough that you're like, whoa, I don't totally know where we're going, but there's definitely something happening here. And then the next chord kind of like makes it make sense, you know? So that is, I do get this sense of like, basically it's like you're walking along and you step on something that isn't actually anything. It's like you're kind of stepping off a cliff for a second. You're like, whoa, wait, there's no ground here. What's happening? And then there's something else that comes along that gives you this feeling of like resolution. Like, is that kind of what you're getting at?
I would say that, and then like if you remember,
Mm-hmm.
so I think a similarity of something that I can play with. or we could talk about that might relate to what you were doing with the triads, Barack. Is like we have this one shape and we're moving it around a lot. And if you remember some of the that we're in sometimes, right? It's I'll just refresh. So it's a that D, just like standard open string chord, and then this like B. What was this? Like a no. This is C sharp something with a 7 maybe.
I think that's just that's an F
F
sharp
sharp
without
without
a
a
root.
root.
Okay, and then a B minor 7,
Mm-hmm.
and then it goes to power chords,
Mm-hmm.
and then back there. And then in the part B, or like what I consider the part B, there's a blend between those two things. So to like think about it theoretically, like there's all of these cool, colorful shapes, and then a very like primal sound that creates a different mood. And then in the part 2, it blends those. So it's like right? So like maybe I have this like one kind of shape that I'm playing with that has all these cool sounds. Maybe I can come up with another triad or like different, like if I'm focusing on ninths so much because the ninth is in that shape, then like maybe I focus on something else for this other type of sound that I want, and then I can mush them around. I don't know.
Yeah, I have a few ideas here. Yeah, I feel like this does a little bit get away from the idea of like the cliff. Um, Maybe. But that yeah, I think that's just worth talking about the other thing that I was thinking about when we brought up the cliff, which I'll basically describe just by using like just like symbols, because this can apply to really like any sort of music or really anything. It's more just kind of like a way of organizing information. So let's say these aren't chord names. These are just like assignments. They're like designators. Let's say that we have a chord progression that's like A, B, C, D. Not as in the chords A, B, C, and D, but just some chord some chord A, some chord that could be called B. Maybe we could say X, Y, Z or whatever. W, X, Y, Z to not think of chord names here. Actually, I'll do that. Okay. And then you have some other chords. So these, let's say uppercase means that there are thirds, and then lowercase means they're power chords. Just for example, like maybe the first time around they're triads and the second time around they're power chords. So there's already that contrast going on, which is super interesting. And then, side note, in the case of sometimes, the power chords, sorry, not the power chords, the open chords are like brighter, like they're using higher strings.
Mm-hmm.
And then the power chords are also dropping in register. So that creates this other feeling of contrast between the notes where it's like this like blossoming thing, and then it kind of like retreats a little bit into itself, and then it opens back up. And this kind of alternation of like sounds that open up and sounds that kind of like retreat is super interesting, and really distinctive, and like still so fresh and cool to me. Okay, so let's say that we've basically got these 4 chords. They can be power chords, they can be triads, or like bar chords, but just things with thirds and things without thirds. And we don't want to add more chords, so we don't want to use, like, let's say challenge, no harmonic contrast to create new sections / no new chords. This is all we've got. Okay, so then if we look at all the other assumptions that we're making with this set of chords, which is like, W, X, Y, Z, 1, I'll just say like assumptions, like 1, they're happening in this order. 2, they're happening for the same amount of time. 3, register, question mark, meaning like where are they being played on the guitar? Are they even just, are they using the high strings? Are they using the low strings? Stuff like that. This one's less important, but it just kind of came to mind. Okay, so the biggest thing that comes to mind, the immediate solution for me, and this is something like, I want to walk you through my thinking so that you have the tools to think through it on your, or at least you have access to these tools to think through it on your own. And if I was trying to be like a Rick Rubin producer, I would just say the thing I'm about to say, which is like, here's the Rick Rubin version, maybe. I mean, I don't mean to like downplay his insights, which are amazing, but it could just be like, what if you just played one chord for longer? In other words, what if it was...
Mm-hmm.
And this was like a B section. This is like 12 bars, because I'm still assuming one bar per chord, you know? And then maybe you just throw in the Z at the end there. That might be too cutesy. That's actually not going to work in shoegaze. That's like some Great American Songbook stuff that's not really right in the style. But for example, also, we might not necessarily want a 12 bar section, because that also is too, that's too like asymmetrical and stuff. We want things that are more kind of like in this kind of like blocky kind of like structural state. So already, okay, so we're not changing these things. Ooh, okay, well, so we're not leaving the world of these chords. I just had an idea that's very interesting to me, which would be power chords the third time. So what we're doing is we're dramatically changing the harmonic rhythm. So rather than one chord every one measure, we're doing one chord every four measures, which is like a really big kind of monolithic shift. And that's related to, I think, the example of slowing something way down. And then what we can do is, actually, there's so much. It's like, there's so much stuff to say. Okay, so we're dramatically slowing things down, and when working this way, this is just, yeah, this is the thing that I wasn't planning on saying, but is actually seeming way more important than all the stuff that I was going to say. When we're working this way, we're in a space where these decisions are very effective, and most kind of conventional music theory logic, which is coming from people who either have like a classical background or like a jazz background, but something where the assumption is that you use a lot of notes and you change things in ways that are more and more complex, but complex in a surface level way. Most of those frameworks will not really help with this type of writing that much. They help a little bit, but what we're really dealing with is this kind of like minimalism thing. Not like minimalism on the surface, like what you're playing is obviously not the same thing as like a Steve Reich thing or a Lamont Young thing, you're strumming and stuff, but it comes from this place of like, what if we make very subtle structural shifts or like very subtle structural transformations that wind up having a big impact, but they don't really call attention to themselves. And the way to build sensitivity to those things is oh man, I'm gonna use a heady word, but this is a heady crew, so I think I can get away with it. Like the word that comes to mind here is like phenomenology, which basically just means like really paying attention while you're playing this or while you're listening to this and asking yourself what the effect of this is. Mm-hmm. And it could be, what is the effect in relation to the previous section? It could be, what is the effect of this on me? Like, how does this affect me, like emotionally or intellectually, or how does this make me think about the guitar differently, or like there are a bunch of different ways that it can interact with you, but the answers will come from paying attention and then making small adjustments and listening to them and thinking about the effects of what they're doing. And in a way, on the surface, this sounds like anti-music theory or like anti-intellectual or something. Not, I guess not to you because you're down with this aesthetic, but like, because it's not like, you can't just give it a fancy name. It's like, we're really dealing with how these small transformations create big effects on us. And so the real zone of like engagement has to do with like listening to those things and then working with them in an intentional way. And so, yeah, that's just the first thing that I really see here is like, for example, way slowing down the harmonic rhythm. And then if we look at it, if we look at these things from a more sort of like, I mean, I'm totally putting on my composerly hat here, but I don't know, I'm trying to give you the realest stuff I can. If we look at it from like a combinatorial perspective, another big word here, you know, and we ask ourselves what are, you know, combinations of all these chords, we can start to go, you know, what if it was W, Z, Y, X, or W, X, Z, Y, etc., you know? And that exists, but this is where the combinatorial thing stops being useful. It's useful for a second. What we want to do is, I believe, create some sort of shift in how this whole section like feels, but we want to do it without chords, or without adding new chords. So if we maintain the same harmonic rhythm and the same strumming pattern, it runs the risk of just feeling like a run-on sentence, you know? And there's room for that. But for me, it seems like the biggest, most effective thing to break up would be the like harmonic rhythm, which is what what if you just played one chord for longer thing is. So the next kind of thing that I would think about if I'm like proceeding like phenomenologically from here is, do I want the feeling of the first chord from the chord progression to begin the next section? Or like, and then we won't know that it's changing until we get to measure 2 and we're like, oh, this chord's still here. And we get to measure 3 and we're like, oh, this chord's still here. And then we get to measure 4 and we're listening to it, we're like, oh, it's still this chord. And then we get the next chord, you know, for example. That would be my kind of just like, how is this going to feel brain? But if we wanted a stronger like mark of we're in a new section and we want it from the downbeat, what I would think about doing would be using any of the other chords. And then obviously like the thing is to just like try different chords and listen to that moment where the new chord shows up and be like, how do I feel about this? Is this the right feeling? And then the other cool thing that you can play with is like, do you want, you know, like just in the case of, I mean, this is the uppercase versus lowercase or like triad versus power chord thing isn't really present in what you were just showing me. Like you were doing different types of chords. This is a very sometimes specific chord kind of shift here. But it could be interesting, like even in the case of what you showed me, if you were only to use the low 3 strings, you know, so that we still get the sense of like a register dropping off, for example. Because if you're not using the high 3 strings, we're going to lose a bunch of the higher notes. And you could use the same chords, but just change the sound in that way. So that's still like a pretty minimal transformation of the sound. And so, for example, what if you went, you know, like, it's going to capitalize this Y, but then I'll decapitalize it. Like you started off a section doing this. So you had your own version of power chords. And even if it's like the one that you were showing me, which would be like not 1-5-1, but like 1-5-9, that's cool too. So that, and then if we get a new chord in a place where we're expecting uppercase W, but instead we get lowercase y, that from the downbeat tells us that we're in a new section. Mm-hmm. And so there's also this question of like, do you want the feeling of transformation to happen on the downbeat, or do you want it to be something that's gradually occurring to the person as the section goes on, you know? And that's kind of rhetorical because all of these are like possible considerations. Yeah. Okay, so that's like, that's kind of how I would think about some of the possibilities of writing a new section if we're using chords and working with chords as the start point. And then I guess the danger for me when I first encountered this sort of thinking, which for me was like super like liberating, because I was like, whoa, there are so many ways I can think about music, is that any system, if you kind of overvalue it and you put you treat it as like the way, can, any way of working will like kind of blind you to other ways of working if you kind of put too much emphasis on it. So this is, if this is useful as a tool, then that's cool. And then also, if you, that wasn't supposed to rhyme, but okay. But also, like, if you just have a sound in mind and you're like, I want the entry of the B section to feel like this, then you can also just kind of follow that feeling. And something that's really useful for me that I used to do a lot, and I don't do it as much anymore because I kind of have my like bag of tricks at this point, which is like how I was able to like just show you all that stuff on the spot, is that I spent just like years figuring that out, basically. Yeah, it's like if you have a feeling in mind for how a transition is supposed to sound, you could just try to describe it in words, and just like journal about it. And I'm big on words. Clearly, I'm using a lot of words right now. There are people who are really amazing music makers who do think through things in an abstract way, but they don't think in words. Sometimes they think in sounds. But having sometimes, if you're having a hard time getting what you want by working with sound, having some external means of thinking that like, yeah, it can be really helpful for getting you to do what you actually want to do with the sound, but your own kind of like all the patterns of thought you have around the guitar or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. One word for each chord. Build it. Oh yeah, this is sick. Cool. Yeah. So basically, like, whether it's words, it could be drawing. Some people will like draw diagrams. I've done some of that, and that can be very helpful too. But it's basically tools that help you get clear on what exactly it is that you're trying to do, that maybe give you some distance from the interface that you're using to do it. In this case, the guitar is the interface, is like a cool way to open up your thinking, so that you can actually get closer to what you're trying to do instead of kind of falling into habits or whatever. So cool. How is this feeling? That was a long speech.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, I have a good starting point for the rest of the day.
Cool.
Very cool.
Awesome. I have one other idea which could be related to this song.
Mhm.
And so they're like, because as far as like chord types, we've got those bar chords, and then there are also the open string chords. And I just kind of wonder if you have two different types of chords, and then sometimes it's triads and power chords. And in this, there's the possibility of power chords, but there's also the open string chords. I wonder about just ways of creating contrast by exploring the back and forth between those two chords, or those two types of chords. I don't know exactly how that relates to what I was just sharing. Like, I couldn't be like, do exactly this, but that seems like an interesting avenue for exploring.
Agreed. Yeah, I was thinking something similar. I was like, I don't know, I finger pick a lot just in personal stuff. And I was like, oh, what if I finger picked and then I introduced like the open A string, which is like a B because it's barred on the first fret. And then like, then I could go all the way down to like this open F string. That's there. Or I guess this would be D sharp.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I'll play around with some of that stuff. I have a lot to mess with now.
Cool. Awesome. Um,